Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. So, like Sebastian said, and thanks again for the intro, I want to talk about what APIs can and cannot do. So it's always a privilege to give a keynote, right? Because you're not supposed to really talk about anything in particular, right? You don't have to talk about any specific tech things. So what I want to talk about is mostly, I think, a little bit of level setting. What, on the one hand, if you're an API practitioner interested in API, what's very interesting in all the API tech stuff, but also to kind of give you a small list of things maybe to look out for, because in the end, we also have to make sure that the APIs are used for something useful, right? And if they're not, in the long term, we'll get into trouble because people will start asking us, what is it that you do playing around with all these APIs? So it's always, I think, important to also take into account that APIs, of course, cannot solve all your problems. And that's basically the topic or the theme of my keynote. So on my next slide, I have hidden a very subtle hint to my Twitter handle. There it is. See if you can find it. If you want to follow along the slides, I've posted the slides online. You can look at them in any browser. They run in the browser. So if you want to look at the slides now or later on, just go to my timeline. My latest or my second latest tweet has a link to the slides. Okay? So just a very, very brief intro about myself. So I'm a tech person myself. I studied computer science in Berlin. I haven't been living in Berlin for a very long time, but this is where things started for me, so to speak, in terms of technology. And I worked on web technologies and communication systems for a long time. And then for the last couple of years, I've worked in a couple of companies that really focus on API topics. So I worked with API Academy. Some of you may know that team. It has been around for quite a while. It doesn't exist anymore because of the transition that CA has undergone. And then I started my own company with a colleague, which we called Good API. And just recently now I actually joined Xway, which is because I had to put the logo here. So now I'm with Xway and still working on APIs, right? That's what's dear to my heart. As part of working in the API Academy, we wrote a book. It was published late last year. It's about continuous API management. So what we thought was interesting and important in the API space was to make sure that people understood that APIs really are not just this one thing that you build and then it's there, but it's something where you need to have a strategy that's really kind of coherent for your whole organization. You need to look at the API landscape, that is what we call it, and try to make sure that this landscape actually delivers the value that in the end you hope to get out of these systems that you're building and the way how you're connecting them with APIs. Just a brief intro about APIs, how I see them. So, of course, being kind of an API professional, right, you always struggle with how do you explain APIs maybe to not core technical audiences. My latest and current attempt is this, beer. It's good. Everybody can relate to beer. And what I usually say about APIs, right? So APIs is just the delivery vehicle, right? So the API, so to speak, is the bottle, the tap, the can. It's not the value, right? The value is the beer, of course. But there's different ways how you can deliver it, right? You can put it in a bottle, that's nice. Maybe it tastes a little bit better, but it's heavy. You can put it in a can, that's a little lighter, but maybe you don't like the slightly different taste or whatever it is. You can have it on tap, which maybe is the best tasting variety of the product, but then again, you can't take it with you, right? So there's different constraints around how you deliver the product, but in the end, if you don't have good beer, it doesn't really matter, right? So I think it's always important to think about the fact that in the end, APIs are not about like having a value in itself. It's unlocking value that your organizations create somewhere and making sure that value can be transported between different parts of your value chain and to the end consumer. And since, if you have a metaphor, right, you also need to explain new things. So this is GraphQL in that metaphor. It's a mysterious thing. I don't know even whether that's a thing in Germany nowadays. Does Germany have these weird aluminum bottles? No? Okay. Well, bad move on my part, but you find those in America, right? So some people have decided that there's a cool new way to drink beer, which is to put it in bottles made out of aluminum, which to me makes no sense. But it's basically just a different way to deliver the same value, right? And to me, that's a little bit what GraphQL is all about, right? So GraphQL, in the end, might have some different constraints. It might have some advantages that other approaches don't have, or it has a different combination of properties that other approaches don't have. But in the end, if you don't have good beer, it doesn't matter, right? And there's a reason why I picked this brand, but I'll skip ahead. Okay, so step back a little bit, digital transformation. So I've literally, in the last couple of years, I've traveled the world and tried to scare people about digital transformation, right? So we've delivered these workshops in all kinds of places. So these are all the ways how I try to explain digital transformation. I always say the same, it's just different places. This was in West Coast US, this was Australia, that was, any guesses where that was? Japan, thank you. Tokyo, right, of course. That's Europe, that's South America, and that is, where's that? Any guesses? South Africa, thank you very much. Yes, South Africa. So everybody's scared of digital transformation. Or everybody understands that they need to do it. And then very quickly, once you run into people who somehow see, oh, we have to do digital transformation, how do we do it, right? They run into this realization that, okay, we probably need to understand tech a little bit better. And I think this is where most of us, assuming that a lot of you are from a tech background as well, right, struggle a little bit, so to speak, and I think the business side as well. That to me, this is actually one of the nicest visualizations I've seen. It's very simple, of course, but that's what nice visualizations are all about. Talks just about, right, how digital transformation basically just means how technology becomes more and more central for your business, which means that both sides need to start understanding each other better, right? And that's challenging for both sides because by their very nature, business people maybe are not deep technologists and technology people are not deep business people, right? So, but it is something that I think is important to kind of absorb, right? That these things are moving together. And the whole idea of digital transformation, to me, means that you can do things together that you cannot do as easily if you are doing just things in a separated way, right? And very quickly, then I think you get to the point where, because it's hard to understand some of the details, where some technologies are being passed around basically, or some approaches, let's say, are being passed around as solving all the problems. And that's kind of where my talk really starts, right? So one of the things I've seen, so all of you, I guess, know this hype cycle, right? It starts with something becoming very popular. Everybody thinks, oh, this is going to solve all of our problems. And then at some point, everybody realizes, no, it's not. And then at some point, hopefully, this is not happening for all technologies, right? But hopefully, people start realizing, it may not solve all of our problems, but it's really useful. And that's something where, me being in APIs, right, I've tried to make sure that this is not too extreme. So what I've seen is this, right? People look at APIs, or people are being sold APIs basically as, do APIs and all of your problems are going to be solved, right? And then you come into some companies who then also sometimes bought our software, right, and said, hey, we're doing APIs now, why isn't everything great, right? And then you're trying to explain them that, yeah, maybe your APIs aren't great, or the rest of your organization doesn't really fit what you're trying to do, or you're basically just doing what you did before, only now you have APIs in between the stuff that you have. So why would that change things dramatically, right? So at that point, I think it's always kind of a risk that organizations have this idea that once we use APIs, all of our problems are going to go away. I don't know, it's a little bit dark, so this is a picture from Zoolander, a wonderfully silly movie with two not-so-bright lead characters. And just making the point, right, that just by using APIs, it's not that all your problems are magically going to be solved. And I think it's important for us in the API space to keep an eye on that and make sure that we tell everybody that there's a lot more that has to be done so that APIs can really deliver the value that you expect from them, right? So at some point, my role sometimes is to walk into the organizations, maybe that's not, and tell them, no, APIs are just plumbing, right? That's supposed to be some pipes, right? So APIs are not really sort of magical fairy dust that you put on your organization and everything works great. It's just plumbing. It's just a way to connect systems, right? And the value that you create is in how good the plumbing is, what kind of stuff you send through the plumbing, to make sure that you can change the plumbing when you have to make sure that you can get it to the right people, that you can get the right stuff in, the right stuff out. That's the value, right? So sure, getting the plumbing right is important. If you don't, that's not good. But you still have to care about what you actually put through the pipes, right? And I think that is really then, once you start understanding that, you can start realizing the value of APIs. And that's kind of much harder work, right? Just starting to use APIs and just like, hey, we have an API, that's not bad, but it's not going to solve all your problems. And I think it's really important in organizations to always have an eye on the fact that the value of APIs can only be realized when you have an eye on what goes through the pipes, how are you enabling those pipes to be reconfigurable, to be kind of flexible sizes, right? To go to the right people, to get the right information in. And that's I think the important part. And I just want to walk you through a very, very brief sequence of things to look out for and what I'm trying to do. So who here knows Louie CK? Some of you do? Okay, so Louie CK is a comedian. I think he's wonderful. He's a little unpopular right now because he has a little bit troubled past, but still great comedian. And he has this wonderful format that's called "Of Course, But Maybe." And the way it works is he talks about these truths where everybody says, of course, this is what we want. And then the but maybe part is always like, yeah, maybe it's not quite that easy, right? So it's like this wonderful thing we all want and believe in. And then the maybe part where it's like, yeah, that would be nice, but actually the world is a little bit more complicated than that. And I want to use this format, of course, but maybe just to walk you through a couple of steps and just give you an idea of how maybe it sometimes can be important to explain to people and to also have an eye on that APIs don't magically solve all your problems, but you really have to work on solving them using APIs, but not just expecting APIs will make them go away. Okay, let's start. So one of the things that people always talk about, like untangling monoliths. So of course, APIs are essential for improving modularity, allowing entangled IT systems to be decomposed into loosely coupled ecosystems and thus being easier to maintain and extend. Of course, right? We all want that. So we all have these monolithic systems, right, that people look at and it's like, oh, we have no idea what this thing is doing, don't touch it, who knows? And we all want to make them better, right? Because monoliths are tricky, hard to scale, maybe brittle, hard to change, right? So it would be nice if we could magically just touch them with the API wand and it would just decompose into wonderful modules, right? And as we all know, modularization is hard. It has been around for decades, long before kind of APIs as we know them were proposed. And if you look at the more general problem of organizational decomposition, right? How do you build organizations that are modular, states, empires, right? That has been around for millennia. How do you organize complex systems into well-defined parts? So it's a really, really hard thing to do, right? And APIs are nowadays way to do it. I totally agree with it. But it's really hard to do, so don't expect that to just happen by pointing some API magic at your monolith and getting a wonderfully modularized system out of that, right? So that won't happen. What will happen if you do that is you get a distributed monolith, right? You get a badly modularized system that runs in a complicated way, and that's kind of the worst thing that you can have, right? So think about that yes, monoliths may be not always great, but decomposing monoliths is hard work, right? And APIs don't just make that happen. Next one, scaling up. Of course, APIs allow you to more easily scale IT resources by only scaling up those parts that actually need to be scaled. Of course, we all want that, right? Scaling is important. And scaling has been around for a long time. I don't know whether you can figure out what that is. Anybody recognizes what that is? Rohrpost, yes. Pneumatic mail, right? It's like these little capsules you put into tubes and they shoot around between different departments. So that has been around for a while, right? How can we build large organizations that pass around documents as fast as we possibly can, right? That goal, again, has been around for a long time. But in order to make that happen, right, we know we need a good loosely coupled architecture. It's going back to the monolith. And we also need to make sure that we can actually scale up things once we have a loosely coupled architecture. Serverless plays a great role there, right? So if we have, that's a big if we have good architecture and we implement it in serverless, we probably have a good platform for scaling, right? But that's a lot of stuff there before you can say, okay, now we can scale, right? So again, right, it's something where, yes, APIs will play an essential part in scaling, but it's not something where you can just magically scale stuff because somewhere in between there's APIs, right? Again, something to look out for where you can't expect APIs to do magic. Next one, monetization. Of course, APIs can be new sources of revenue, allowing cost-effective experimentation with digital offerings and creating new revenue streams beyond the traditional sources of income. Of course, who doesn't want more money, right? And so this is something, sometimes you walk into organizations and basically they say, we heard you can make money with APIs. We would like to use APIs, right? And then you try to explain to them, it's probably not the best approach to do APIs, to just expect, now you can print money because you have APIs. I paid for that picture, by the way. So please admire it. Okay. So, right, in the end, in most cases, making money doesn't depend on having the right delivery. It depends on having the right product, right? Yes, you want to deliver it in the right way, that you can actually get the product to your customer, but the important thing is the product, not the delivery, right? And APIs are delivery. So most organizations should really focus on the value they create and not on the fact how can we deliver it in a way and monetize that immediately. And in most cases, really, by far the most cases, it's not the right approach to look at APIs as we can charge for API access, right? In most cases, that doesn't work. In most cases, it's much more important to think about how can I improve the value I create by using APIs, right? Again, taking a step back from this rather simplistic starting point. Fourth point, communications. Of course, APIs are the way how to communicate in digital environments, and via APIs, all capabilities can easily interact throughout the organization and beyond. Of course, we all want this, right? We all want organizations that can talk to each other. So we don't want these organizations where nobody knows what somebody else is doing. So ideally, we want to be able to make sure that everybody can talk to everybody. But turns out, right, it's really tricky to make that happen, to have everybody talking to each other. Even if technically they can, they still need to know each other, find each other, understand each other. And that's a hard problem. And it's not a hard problem that just goes away by saying, oh, now you can use APIs. Again, APIs can play an important role. Pick the uptake of portals and these kind of things is a clear sign that organizations want to do that. But again, it's not something that just magically happens. And the last part that's connected to that is organization issues, right? So, and that's the hardest part, so I left it last, right? So organizational issues means, of course, APIs can help with improving the way how teams communicate and how the organization can innovate, of course, right? So this idea of Netflix and Google and Amazon and all these companies that are being passed around as poster childs for being very innovative and being able to do that because they use, in part, APIs, right? So you want all these different things. That's just kind of a random diagram of a complex service mesh. You want all these things to be dynamic so that teams can build new things without being held up by other teams, right? But again, if you do complicated things, organizing that is not something that just becomes trivial because you use APIs, right? So you have to make sure that you understand the complexity of your domain, and you don't expect that just because you have APIs, now everybody gets busy innovating, right? You still have to make that happen. And you have to make sure that you have the right structure in your organization, because Conway's law, that you probably all know, right, tells you that if your organization has like a strange organizational setup, that's basically the setup that you will find in your IT system, right? And you don't want that to happen. Okay, and with that, I have shown you all my of course maybes. And in conclusion, What I think is important to understand, and here I briefly have to switch to German because I think it's a better phrase in German, the notwendig, aber nicht hinreichend. I learned that at university and actually in logics, right? That some things are necessary conditions, but they're not sufficient. And sometimes it's actually a little bit hard to wrap your head around this because notwendig sounds kind of strong, right? But it's the same for APIs. In my mind, APIs are necessary but not sufficient for digital transformation. You have to make sure that you have the right approach and processes around this. So APIs will always require you to look at the business, the organization, and of course technology. We all know this, but we also should keep this in mind. And we also have to make sure that we have like a continuous cycle, right? This is what we started when I presented briefly our book of continuous API management, right? You have a continuous cycle of looking at how are my APIs doing. Are they realizing the value that I want them to realize? If not, what do I have to fix? How can I make sure that my organization actually aligns with what I'm trying to do in IT so that in the end the APIs can deliver the value that they theoretically can, right? And I think that really is the lesson that I want to leave you with, that for all of us in the API space, I think we work in a really, really, really powerful area that can change things dramatically. But we also have to understand that we have to make sure that we actually take all these other things with us. And we talk to the people who are not just into APIs. Because if we don't do this, we limit ourselves to just doing tech stuff that doesn't really matter as much as it could if we had this little bit bigger perspective. Okay, thank you very much. With that, I'd like to finish. Again, the slides are online. If you want to go there, this is the URI where you can find them. If you want to get in touch, feel free to ping me on various media or just talk to me here. Thank you very much. I wish you all a wonderful conference. I'm sure we have 2 great days ahead of us. And I think with that, I can pass on the baton to Jared, I think, is up next. Okay, thank you.